YouTube. Welcome to another Wednesday night study, specifically the Renewing Your Mind series and specifically the Imagination mini series. We're on part 2 of the Imagination mini series, and I have some pretty awesome insights to share with you tonight. So it's not going to be really the way that we thought it was. When last time I spoke, we had kind of some plans about how this was going to go, and I've had some really amazing revelations since then. And so I definitely want to share it with you guys. So the first thing that we probably need to do is we need to talk about American culture. Now, I know that American culture, as we'll call it right now, is not what American culture was during the Revolution. We need to talk about the Revolution because there is definitely a underlying theme of Torah present in the early settlers of America. That's partially, of course, because of the Puritans, but also probably just people sick of being treated a certain way. So one of the things that we did is we kind of tried to figure out, well, what were the problems, right? We tried to figure out what is causing us to want to disconnect ourselves from England. Two of the really big ones was overtaxation and persecution of religious groups. Of course, the Anglican Church frowned upon any splinter Protestant groups. And so, in general, the Church of England was ran by the king. And of course, you know that a church that's ran by a king is probably not going to teach people that they are more powerful than what they've been led on to believe, and that there's a promise of prosperity that could supersede the king if they followed the model. What's my point? My point is that generally speaking, it was a very inappropriate religion, as it were, for the common people, and so that was one of our concerns that were brought up. And of course, over time, we had kind of a development of civil liberties, and we had things where people were beginning to be protected as freemen, and then eventually, obviously, we got into the Emancipation Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. The premise, though, has become one of, I have a right not to listen to you, and I have a right to not not agree with you to the extent of making you not speak and not propagate your opinion, perception, etc. We have encroached very deeply upon a dystopian version of the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to get too much into that. If you noticed, I don't spend a whole lot of time in political discussions, and there's a reason for that. That, maybe privately you could potentially ask me, but generally speaking, we can say that the Bill of Rights that was present at the signing of the Constitution of the United States of America is not really the Bill of Rights that's present today. However, what has replaced it is a sense of what we're going to call entitlement. But before we get into that, that's just a little brief thing. In fact, that's kind of one of those things where you could potentially, you could probably say that you could turn off the video because that's kind of the point that I'm going to make tonight. There's more to it, of course, but that's the gist of it, is that we've gone from a Bill of Rights to a Bill of Entitlements. We're going to talk about that. But first, what we need to do is talk a little bit about tense in Hebrew, okay? So in Hebrew, we don't have a differentiation between a desire of the future and a completion. For example, it will say something along the lines of, let's say that I'm going to kick a soccer ball and I have not yet kicked it, right? So I get ready to go kick the ball, and the announcer says, and he has kicked the ball, anticipating that as an action. Now, we see a kind of a repetition of this in the function of Yeshua's statement, hey, if you believe that you have already received something, then you will receive it. In other words, we need to kind of operate in this future tense state. However, we don't believe it as I will receive, but I have received, right? Well, that's kind of how Hebrew works in their speech. So, for example, they will have not yet crossed the Red Sea. And instead of it saying that the people are crossing the Red Sea, it'll say, and they crossed the Red Sea. And then all of a sudden, it'll say that they got to the other side, right? So my point is that sometimes Hebrew future references with a completed or what we call a perfect, okay? Now, there's a few reasons why that's important, but then we have a incomplete action, and that seems to be more accompanied to what we would call the imperative or a command. You shall or you shall not. And when we get into the Hebrew grammar there, it's interesting because a lot of times, for example, when it says, you shall not murder, what it says is, you shall murder not, right? There is a negation particle stopping that. But notice it doesn't say, you shall not murder in the sense of there being a command not to murder. There's a command to murder, and then there's a negation particle on it. So that's kind of how Hebrew works. In terms of tenses, that can be important because if I say, I will do something, then interestingly enough, that becomes a promise. It's an incomplete action. It's an imperfect, right? And it references the future. Well, when we start to get into the assignment of present tense, things get a little bit complicated in the Hebrew. It doesn't necessarily say, and he is asking. So let's say that somebody is asking somebody for something, and it'll say, and he has asked, and he has asked for the bride, and it's literally present tense. Again, what's interesting about that is this kind of this function or belief that in that process, it's being stated as a completed action, even though it's not completed. Now, there are a few reasons why this is true, but one of the biggest reasons why this is true is because Hebrew operates off of faith. Remember, Hebrew is not a language, it's a lifestyle. And the language became pictures of the lifestyle. So let's take, for example, Joe Schmo, right? Lives in, say, anywhere, USA, and works at any place, right? And so this guy, he has a routine, his daily routine. He goes and he gets on the bus, he goes to work, and he takes a break at, say, 10:15, and then eats lunch at 12, and then takes a break again at 2:15, and then goes home at 3, and rides the bus back and gets home at 4, right? So that's our little routine. Well, the way that Hebrew would work is there would be a drawing of a man getting up out of the bed. And that would mean morning, or that would mean breakfast, right? So the premise is that the lifestyle is drawn onto pottery, and then we have interpreted it into a word system, and phonics were assigned from a foreign sounding entity. In other words, in the beginning, it was a pictographic language that did not have phonics attached to it. Now, I don't completely understand how that works. You can reference that in the Mystery of the Alphabet, amazing book. So at any rate, this derivation of Semitic as the ancient language and therefore some sort of reference of how things would operate. Intriguingly enough, we have the lifestyle as a lifestyle of faith or belief, of mythos, right? Of a belief in a monotheistic God in a society of pantheon. In other words, everyone around the Hebrews believed in more than one God, worshiped more than one God, and practiced God worship in a way that was foreign to the Hebrews. Well, there's a few reasons why that's important, but the biggest reason why is because that is a lifestyle and not a language. But that lifestyle was then drawn onto pictographs, and then those became letter pairs that became parent roots that eventually became lexical roots, which has the three characters or the three radicals. The relevance comes from the fact that in terms of tense, a lexical root falls not into the infinitive like in English. For example, in English, when we look in a dictionary or lexicon, we see the infinitive. So like to run or to eat, right? It's like the action without any beginning or end and no associated subject, right? No associated object. On the other hand, in Hebrew, the lexical root is actually perfect, meaning what? A completed action, masculine, which means he, specifically he, third person, singular, okay? And so as a result of that, when we look at words in their action, in their verbal lexical form, in the Strong's we see infinitives, but in the actual Hebrew, that's not the case. In the actual Hebrew, we are actually encountering a perfect or completed action as the verb existing by itself. There's intrigue there. However, again, like I said before, present tense is referenced by completed actions. And he has climbed the mountain, which is what? He's in the process of climbing the mountain, right? Okay, so why bring this up? Well, in my process of learning, I encountered an evangelist. I'm not going to mention his name, and he is going to prefer not to be identified, but he showed a diagram of the parable of the sower. And as he was showing the diagram of the parable of the sower, he began to assign tenses to the different places where the seed had fallen. And he said, well, this is past tense, and this is present tense, and this is post tense. And then he was assigning human conditions to each of those. And he assigned wounds to the past, to the rocky soil. He assigned cares of the world to the present, right? And then he assigned the birds eating the seeds to the future. And when he did that, all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, I have to restructure the entire Renewing Your Mind series. Because what I did is I started with wounds, and that's okay because that's past. But then I jumped straight to limiting beliefs, and contrary to popular belief, that's not present. That's future. It's a future tense filter. But what is absolutely true of the present is entitlement. So we were going to address entitlement tonight, but what's interesting is that there's this connection between the parable of the sower, the word of God, which is Torah. You can go back and watch my series that prepares you for the book of John to see about what is the Word of God, what is the actual scriptures, and what is the actual Tanakh, and then what is the quote unquote New Testament as we know it, and what is the Old Testament as we know it, et cetera, et cetera. But in this series, what we're going to do is we're just going to flat out say that the Word of God is Torah, right? And the gospel is the promise that was given in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, which is what? You will be a peculiar people, a holy nation, a royal priesthood. Well, in all of that process, we have something very interesting going on. In times past, I have talked to you about the premise of imagination. And as you have noticed, remember, I went like this. I said, what keeps a human from being effective is their wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements. Now, I'm going to alter that because why? I want the entitlements where they belong, in the present. Because there is a concept of reality where you are supposed to be present. But what's intriguing is that we have done something in the present that is just like, okay. So the premise is that what we have going on here is wounds, limiting beliefs and entitlements, right? And a what? Lack of imagination. So now we superimpose or we overlay lack of imagination over all three. So last time I spoke about what happens with a wound and what the function of imagination is in that process. Tonight, we're going to talk about the function of imagination in entitlements. So entitlements are intriguing because the truth is that there is actually a protection of humans present in Torah. However, Torah does not apologize for its social awkwardness and or what would be today called bigotry or bias. Okay? Torah doesn't apologize for that. The intensification of all power in the universe doesn't apologize for that. And by the way, just so you know, it doesn't really care whether you like it or not. And it's not about being some malevolent jerk. It's about the idea that what we do with our brains is sometimes contradictory than what he does with his brain, if we could really call it a brain. What the intensification of all power in the universe does as an intelligence versus what we do as an intelligence, how about that? Are sometimes contradictory. And we could either just go with it that we don't care and disassociate ourselves from it, or we can understand that if he has created a force of benefit, that force of benefit is not going to push past those limitations that we create, stating that we do not want to be aligned with that. Okay, that was a really long way of saying that there are people who believe the law has been done away with, and there are people who believe that the law is inappropriate for this day and age. Okay. So enough about that. I won't harp on that anymore, because what we need to get into is how imagination actually works. So the intrigue behind imagination has to do with the fact that imagination is not memory at first. When we first have information come in through the eye gate, the ear gate, right? Sometimes actually feeling, right? So we hear, we see, and we feel, we taste, we smell, and those all become what we call mnemonically attached to the brain. Now, when I say mnemonically, what I mean is that there's an actual process by which memory is categorized. when we think about this, there's a few things that are very important. The first one is that we always try to operate from a frame of reference because our brain is a learning machine. And learning machines have a tendency to categorize information in like kind. In that sense, let's say that we don't like let's say the color magenta, okay? And so for whatever reason, we don't like that color. Anytime that we encounter anything magenta, we automatically have a bias towards it. That's because of that idea of how your brain categorizes things. And so here is where the intrigue comes in. When you have an imagination and you begin to make a micro adjustment upon it, what do I say by micro adjustment? I mean that thoughts will have a tendency to invoke emotion. Emotion will have a tendency to invoke memory. Okay. And memory is context sensitive, so emotion has to be present. Context has to be present. The state of your body, like if you were drunk or you were sober, whether you were cold or hot, certain things can trigger memories. And sometimes you'll be like sitting at the table eating your dinner, and all of a sudden Disneyland when you were 7 years old pops into your head because of how you were holding your spoon, the taste of the food, and the humidity at that moment. That's memory context. Okay. But what's interesting is that if your brain thinks that something is magenta, it will file it with magenta. Okay. So all of the things that pertain to magenta are all contained under the same category and emotional attachment. And so as we encounter magenta, it files it under magenta and immediately attaches that emotion to it. So you're like, magenta, right? We have a reaction to it, right? Even if magenta becomes something amazing, we will still have that little bit of adverse reaction to it because it's getting categorized. Instead of it having its own special place, it's getting categorized. Well, here's where the power of imagination working on not on your behalf comes into play. There are two ways in which entitlements work. The first is either a deletion of a commandment or a deletion of a regulation. The second is a distortion or manipulation. What's interesting is as information comes into our gates, we have a tendency to delete, distort, and generalize. That generalization says, oh, file it under magenta. Distort says, oh, it can't be anything better than any other magenta I've encountered, right? And then, of course, deletion is, okay, I'm deleting the part that this is a human. I'm deleting the part that this is a female friend of my brother's. And, I'm deleting the part because she's wearing the magenta shorts. So you delete that entire conversation in memory. So all you remember is the stupid shorts, right? And so the premise is that you lock that in. And now all of a sudden, magenta shorts reminds you of your soon-to-be sister-in-law, and there's actually no function beyond that of who she is. So now picture the idea that you have to come up with, you have to scheme, you have to construct a false reality to overcome a limitation that is a realistic limitation given to you that gives you instruction to do or not do something to where you choose to do or not do something. Now, this is going to become powerful because what's going to happen is after you go through the system of imagination to create the entitlement, it gets filed as a memory. Which means what? It becomes an autonomic, subconscious response to the limitation. Let's talk a minute about limitations. I think anybody who actually understands parenting will understand why a child needs to not go outside the yard. There's a fence around the yard. Child has learned how to operate the gate. You say, no, you can't go outside the fence. Now, in the child's mind, they don't know why they can't go outside the fence, right? And they think in their minds, oh, you know what? I probably could go outside the fence because maybe mom or dad doesn't actually know that there's something important outside the fence. Now, here's the intrigue. This is actually a very animalistic response to instruction. An animalistic response to instruction is going to test the limitation to see whether or not it's actually a limitation. The dog is going to pull on the chain until it gets to the longest point and starts to restrain it from moving. The dog is not going to operate within the chain until it knows the extent at which the chain pulls it. I'm sorry, it pulls the chain. And then so we have that premise that there's kind of an override that occurs. Well, I know how to open the gate. And not only that, but there's something out there that I'm curious about. And so we began to construct an imagination how that is more important than the instruction to stay in the yard. Now, is this manipulation? No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. This can also just be the simple curiosity of a child. But when we start to get into adulthood, we get a little bit sinister with our imagination, don't we? So the premise is that the child now understands they can operate the gate. They want to go outside the fence. Mom's instruction to not go outside the fence has not registered as a memory per se, in that is not registered as a learning yet. It's an instruction that's present, that's a limitation that has no actual frame of reference by which it can be given information. For example, let's say we say, don't touch the stove, it's hot. And let's say that we've even taught the child the difference between cold and hot. You have something cold, it feels this way. You have something hot, it feels this way. Now, one could argue that there's probably children out there who will actually just listen to their mommy and not touch the stove. But there's a lot of children out there who are going to reach out and touch the flame or touch the stove or turn on the stove, even though they've been instructed not to. And then they get a little burn or they get singed or whatever. Something puts that in a new category. That commandment becomes a new category, a new memory of hot, right? And so as they look at that commandment, they say, okay, I don't want hot again, right? But before then, it's not really functional as a learning, it's just knowledge or information. So it's easy in the beginning when you're younger to come up with imaginations on why you should be able to do something. Maybe you feel capable. Maybe you feel like maybe mom doesn't know what she's talking about. Maybe you're one of those kids that actually needs an explanation, right? That it causes pain or whatever. But what's interesting is as an adult, when we encounter instruction to not do something, we begin searching through the dictionary of information in our heads about why shouldn't we do that thing? And not only that, but we find in there loopholes. Well, what if I do it this way? Is it still doing it? Right? Well, here's the interesting thing about that. That is new brain. Okay? That is neuroplasticity. That is new brain cells being created and categorizing that information according to the reference system and acknowledging is it it as part of a set. Now, why is that important? Because new information has not yet become memory until it gets categorized. So we begin to think about, well, what if I did it this way, right? Would it still be violating that instruction? Will it still create the cognitive dissonance? One of the brain's favorite things to do is to disassociate from discomfort. And what do I mean by that? That it will begin to actually withdraw itself from the sensations, emotions, and cognitions of the present moment in order to avoid the discomfort that can include pain, pressure, right? And it can also include cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is basically where you have a reference system, an expectation, and what actually presents itself to your senses does not meet that expectation, and therefore there has to be a reconciliation. Somehow they have to get along. The brain's ability to disassociate from discomfort means that there is actually an ability to disassociate from the present moment of instruction in order to actually break a rule or violate instruction. Remember, it either needs to be deleted or it needs to be distorted. That whole idea of coming up with those loopholes, that whole idea of coming up with well, what if it happened this way? Would it still be a violation? You know what I mean? Now, here's the part that's interesting. When it's new material, it's not yet become memory because there's a very specific kind of hormone / vitamin type of thing that actually causes something to become memory. And that's going to become important in the next message, but also it is important in this message. Because once we start to construct new material, when we use our imagination to construct new material, we're not using our past references. We're not looking at our past references and saying, oh yeah, you know what? Actually, I need to reference it this way and categorize it this way. So thought is either going to be past tense, present tense, or future tense. What's interesting is when we are dealing with entitlement, we are trying to imagine a reality where the commandment doesn't exist, where the instruction doesn't exist, where the limitation doesn't exist. So you could see where this might be important when we get into limiting beliefs, yes. But the idea of actually identifying that you have an option to do something that you've been told not to do, or you have an option to not do something you've been told to do, is about entitlement. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Isn't entitlement about believing that you deserve something? Absolutely. But that's not necessarily all of it. What entitlement really is an elimination of the limitation through either disassociation from the cognitive dissonance or a deletion of the commandment altogether. Now, how do we delete an instruction, commandment, rule? How do we delete that from our brain without there actually being a deletion in reality? Let's say that we are driving down the road and the speed limit, and that means the amount that you are only allowed to go, maximum speed limit. You're not allowed to go any further past that limitation, is 65 miles an hour. Now you're driving down the road at more than 65 miles an hour, okay? Now, what we need to get into is the justification for the speed limit. Let's talk a minute about that. Because this is kind of how Torah works, okay? Now, when a cop when a state patrolman, sheriff, police officer pulls you over because you've been going over the speed limit, they actually look at the speed limit as what? Unbiased, no exceptions, no mitigating factors. Okay. In other words, there's nothing that actually says that that speed limit is anything other than what it is, a speed limit, and you broke it. But that's what the officer says. So what is that? That is because I told you so, right? We remember that from when we were kids, because I told you so. The cop does not care about the science behind the speed limit. So now let's get further into the speed limit. Some guy at some research facility grabbed an SUV, jumped into it, and drove it around the corner until it tipped over, until it rolled. Some guy got behind another guy on a long runway, and this guy slammed on his brakes, and this guy slammed on his brakes, and he still hit him because of how fast they were going and what their spacing was. So then that all of a sudden becomes, if you were going this speed and were able to, and had correct spacing, and were able to brake, could you stop, right? So length of braking, et cetera, is going into the speed limit. Also, wear and tear on the vehicle, tires, all kinds of stuff has gone into the research for the speed limit. None of that matters, right? Well, let's say that let's look at a different rule. Let's look at the rule of the stove. Well, let's see. We've got pain. We've got injury. We've got potential responsibility of the parent in terms of neglect. We've got a possible house fire or other things, right? We've got potential property damage depending on what we use to try to test the fire on the stove, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not speaking from experience. So in that premise, I think that it is very important that we understand that in that sense, it doesn't really matter why. Mom said so, so it's because I told you so, right? Told you not to touch that stove. Why? It doesn't matter why. I said no, right? Okay. That's kind of the officer on the side of the road, like, okay, you were going 15 over. I don't care why you were going 15 over. Now, if we apply my teaching from the Racham series, you would see that it's human compassion that might mitigate that. They might say, okay, I might give you a warning, but you did do it and you were told not to, and it doesn't matter the whys. It doesn't matter the science. So now your brain does one of two things. Either A, it thinks that by you going, say, 8 over the speed limit, you're not going to be pulled over, right? So there's one element. I can go over the speed limit and not get pulled over because they don't care about people who go over this amount, right? So now all of a sudden you can break that instruction. The imagination required to come up with that has gone through the scenario and started to look at the loopholes, as it were. But if you think about the science behind the vehicle, you might say, oh, well, my vehicle has better handling. There's another imagination. It's new information that does not affect, I told you so, and does not affect the science that's been given. For example, let's say we talk about the commandment not to eat pork, right? Science has proven that eating pork is detrimental to your health. Now, they claim that there's a way to maybe avoid it, maybe, right? If you actually go and you do the research, it's very, very hard to get rid of a parasite in meat, okay? And in terms of meat contamination, which is the simplicity of using the same blade to cut the pork and cut the beef, or cut the pork and cut the chicken, or vice versa, any of those possibilities. We have cross-contamination, et cetera, et cetera. But you were told not to eat it. That's the state patrolman on the side of the road going, I told you not to eat it, right? You were told not to eat it, right? That it doesn't matter why. So we can look at all the whys. So then now here comes Joe Christian, who has been told by his pastor that it's okay to eat pork, and has been told by his rabbi friend, hey, you shouldn't do that. And he says, you know, as long as I cook it at this temperature, I'm safe from those parasites. That is the imagination part. Coming up with, creating a picture of a different reality. A reality where it's actually okay to consume pork. A reality where it's okay to touch the stove. A reality where it's okay to go over the speed limit. It requires you to use your imagination. But what people don't realize about imagination is it becomes memory, and therefore it becomes a subconscious operation. So where does entitlement actually activate? Entitlement does not activate upon the imagination itself. That's why we're supposed to cast vain imaginations under the obedience of Christ. An actual entitlement occurs after it has become a memory that now becomes a reference point by which any other information coming in has to go through that filter first. Now, whatever speed limit sign you see, you apply that filter. I'll go 8 over the speed limit. Can you imagine a vehicle hitting a child at 30 miles an hour versus 20 miles an hour? You can see a concept here of there being a big difference. And let's say we go 35 miles an hour. Oh, well, I didn't see a speed limit sign. I'm going to assume that it's 35 because it's normally 35 in the city. How about if we were to go 15 miles an hour through a posted 20? What does that do to your brain? Well, nothing until you hit the kid, right? Now, all of a sudden, something interesting has occurred. You hit the kid and you were going less, so there's less injury. But see, that's that whole thing of getting burned on the stove, right? That's the whole thing of having a worm eat your brain. Until that consequence comes, you're going to operate off of your frames of references in order to interpret or perceive your reality. Well, there's another piece of intrigue behind this, and that is the idea of like kind attracting like kind. So we go from an imagination about an option to what? To violate, or let's call it, to overcome a limitation. So we have the option to overcome a limitation that's not present in reality, but instead in an imagined world or an imagined reality. And that eventually becomes a memory, which then becomes a subconscious operation until it is interrupted. And here's the intrigue. The only time the subconscious really has an interest in interacting with reality versus your conscious is when there is cognitive dissonance or discomfort like pain. That's why we hear in the recovery world, pain is a catalyst for change. Discomfort will cause you to course correct. But before that discomfort is present, there are actual neuropeptides present that are causing you to categorize, delete, and generalize imaginations into realities that actually give you permission to what? to go outside of your limitations. Now, obviously, that's a good thing when we get to the limiting beliefs, right? But now let's start to look at the other side of this thing, because there are people who feel entitled to things and call them rights when they are not actually that. I have a right to go 5 miles over the speed limit. God knows it takes forever to get to work in the morning, and I want to beat the traffic. And I don't do it all the time. I only do it in the morning when I'm rushing. So what's the big deal? Do you hear all those words? All of that information that was just communicated has nothing to do with the speed limit sign, but in your brain becomes the world that you operate in. So as you're ripping down the road at, say, 40 and a 25, and in your brain, it's because you don't want to get caught in traffic, because then you'll be late to work and then you'll have some sort of infraction. When the truth is that what you're really entitled to is leaving early to go to work. So what's interesting is you could use your imagination and try to figure out the reasons why you don't have to do something, or why you can do something that you're not told not to do. Or you can use your imagination to figure out how you can do the thing that you need to do and not violate your conscience, and not violate people's rights, and not violate instruction, not violate information that creates a limitation. So that's one part of entitlement, right? But then we start to get into that people feel entitled to property, or they feel entitled to exploit or utilize the resources of a human being because of some sort of thing that reduces their value. This is the dangerous part of entitlement. The reason why I presented limitation first is because limitation usually is the fence in front of social injustice. You see, I'll remind you that the Hebrews lived in a culture that, or were surrounded by a dominant culture of their time that was pantheistic and that violated social justice. They would exploit human beings, specifically females and children. They would sacrifice. Let's talk a minute about human sacrifice. Let's talk about why it worked and how it worked and what was the point behind it. So the why it worked has to do with confirmation bias, right? So the simple act of believing that this stone statue causes rain to fall if I take some sort of loss to my enjoyment, my assets, etc. Okay? So the premise is that they saw the rain fall and saw the rain not fall, but believed that it was somehow controlled by this God, and so there had to be some sort of loss. Now, it's interesting because for some reason there is an association with sacrifice of a premise of violent sacrifice. In other words, when a human was sacrificed, they were not sacrificed in a manner that was gentle or comforting. Not that that would really change that actual abominable behavior in any way, but the whole idea is that they made sure that they were terrified, that they were violently and without anesthesia, surgeries performed, et cetera, as part of it, right? Disembowelment, et cetera, cutting out the human heart while it's still attached to the rest of the body in order to create an extraordinary amount of discomfort, an extraordinary amount of pain, to create torture, to make it rain, and then it would rain. And so there was a confirmation bias present, and therefore they concluded that this is what they could do. And so they were entitled to murder. The same was true of temples that were dedicated to fertility when it came to virgin children. Again, some sort of entitlement, right? The same was true of religions and of pantheistic worship that had to do with the sacrifice of animals. They couldn't just cut the throat, drain the blood. They had to terrorize the animal beforehand. All in the name of believing that the suffering somehow satiated and therefore created an option of blessing from those gods. Now, the intrigue comes on the part of believing that your crop is not going to grow, therefore it's okay to slit the poor man's throat while he's screaming and yelling. The sickness here comes in the idea that there is somehow an option to utilize the resources of another human being or exploit another human being or abuse another human being or murder another human being in the name of benefit to yourself. But then we can take it a step further and say that another element of this is the need to overcome the limitation that says that you should not do it. Now you see why I presented the limitation first. Now let's get into exploitation. Now let's get into theft. Now let's get into the 10 Commandments, including honor your mother and father. I recently spoke with a person who felt justified in not honoring their mother and father because their mother and father had somehow disqualified themselves from morality and therefore didn't deserve to be treated with honor, even though the commandment says so. Now, I could get into all sorts of scenarios in which we can talk about horrible things that mothers and fathers have done and how that means that you don't need to honor them. I get that, okay? I understand that somebody who's been abused does no longer need to listen to the authority of the person who abused them. And they have a right, not an entitlement, a right to feel safe and a right to be okay. Right? So don't think that I'm getting into some sort of thing where a person has to do things a certain way. That is kind of splitting hairs. And what I'm more looking for is the fact that people will come up with imaginations on why they have an entitlement to exploit, abuse, and use people. I want you to think a minute about your values. Think a minute about that moment where you all of a sudden are in love with someone, or that moment where you feel protective of your child. Somebody actually has looked at your emotion of protectiveness of your child and has come up with a reality where that doesn't matter, right? That's the human traffickers, right? That's the people who have turned exploitation into a business. One of the biggest things that I have encountered when it comes to exploiting human beings, when I've talked to people who have done that, it wasn't anything personal. I just wanted their stuff. It wasn't anything personal. It was just business. Torah protects the human being from exploitation, from abuse. Torah protects the woman more than it does the man. Torah protects the child more than it does the woman. People don't realize that, but that's true. Now, here is the interesting part of this discussion. I want you to recall that I mentioned neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is where the brain is expanding to store more information and can actually repair itself from damage. Now, here is the intrigue. You are utilizing brain cells that have expanded from the normal reference system present to create a new reality by which you are eventually going to exploit another human being. And somehow the information you have about them has reduced their value and rights. Now, if you don't believe this is true, because you think that you somehow are not somebody who exploits people, I will propose to you that the self-actualization that has to occur in order for you to not be in that realm of entitlement is only 10% of the population. 10% of 8 billion people actually don't come up with imaginations to create justifications on why they should not follow a limitation that eventually is going to lead to exploitation. I know that sounds off the wall. Why would me speeding down the road eventually lead to me treating someone with less respect or dignity? Because it's all about cognitive dissonance. Remember, Paul at one point in time says that they had their consciences seared. Let's talk a minute about searing. So searing is a way to lock in the juices. Now, of course, when we're talking about that in terms of surgery or something else, you're preventing bleeding. We're locking a liquid into a tissue, right? That's searing. You could say that searing can prevent something from changing its composition. For example, let's say that you have a shoelace that is fraying. You can actually light a lighter and melt the ends and get it back into. So that's not quite the searing I'm talking about. I'm talking about the idea of preventing the flow of something, right? So when I'm going to make a juicy steak, I'm going to sear all the sides to make sure that so that it locks in the flavor, locks in the juices. It's juicy on the inside, crusty on the outside. So now let's talk about that in terms of searing your heart. What actually flows into the heart? When we as human beings show the heart, how do we show it? Right? Do we draw the ventricles? Do we draw the sides of the heart, the two muscles? Or do we actually do this right here, right? We think of the word love as a heart, and we think as the heart as love. And now you're going to sear your heart, which means what? You're going to prevent the flow of love. Well, let's recall what that is. The flow of love flows through the conduit of what? Racham, of compassion. Remember, Torah is the fullest extent of the law, and then we add a human being because why? They have compassion. They are familiar with the failings of a human and therefore can offer mercy to the guilty, right? Can offer mitigation to the fullest extent of a sentence, can offer mitigation to someone who's speeding down the road because their wife is about to have a baby. What man would pull over a human being who is about to have a baby and give them flack about it? They're actually required to preserve the life of that baby over that mother. And here's the intrigue in all of that. Most likely, they are going to authorize a breaking of the speed limit and assist you in it. But the justification that you formulated for speeding is still imagination. It's still new information being added to the old frames of reference. So imagination is actually creating something new in order to alter the reality in front of you. But what people don't realize is, remember, the universe is conspiring on your behalf to be absolutely, not conditionally, obedient to the sons of Adam. Meaning what? As we begin to visualize and make our micro adjustments, it becomes memory and now a subconscious autonomic response to a limitation. The universe responds in kind. Like kind attracts like kind. And so as a result of that, our entitlements become a false reference system of abundance and blessing, which is what? Confirmation bias. It's the rain falling on the murderer who believed that this stone statue could cause rain to fall if he beats the crap out of somebody and digs out their heart. Same you, right? Same person, same exploitation. You see, the heart doesn't have a compartmentalization system by which you can be a little bit bad and a lot good, or a little bit good and a lot bad. Don't get me wrong, there's a dynamic of failings of a human being, but what I'm trying to say is that if you believe that you're entitled to something small and you receive it, the confirmation bias and reward system behind classical conditioning tells your brain and subconscious that it can respond that way now, that it can assume that. And that's exactly what we begin to do. We assume an entitlement. It stops being a cognitive dissonance because there's a steering of the flow of love, right? And so the premise is when it says love your neighbor as yourself, and Yeshua gives this big old discussion because the Jews come up to him, I think it was the scribes come up to him and say, well, who is my neighbor? Right? And so he illustrates this whole idea of how love overcomes the social injustice of class inequality, right? But then also the social injustice of race inequality, because why? They treated Samaritans different because they were not Jewish. And so in that process, he now is what? He's saying, this guy who you guys think is racially unfit for Torah and racially unfit for the kingdom of heaven and for the renewed covenant is the one who actually helps the one who was robbed. Right? Now, it's interesting because then within all of that process, we begin to see the function of there is no categorization in the heart. If you create an entitlement here, you will create an entitlement here. So how do we avoid it? You need to remember, I've told you before, I can take your merit and I can take all of your beliefs about what you think you deserve in your house, and I can defeat them with your demerits. In other words, let's say that we attached you believing that you deserve to have this item in your house because you're a good person. I can take one of your bad deeds, attach it to that, and remove that from your home. I can clear an entire house with your entitlements. Because it is a false sense of desert. When we understand that the sun shines on the just and the unjust, then we understand that there is a process by which it has nothing to do with you earning it. It has nothing to do with your merit. You can't do good enough to cause a paycheck to appear in your bank account. You have to do something. And that something is a consideration, right? So in your brain, you don't realize that somehow you're going to be provided for. So in your mind, you say, well, that's my hard-earned dollar. That's how I'm going to spend it. And the truth is that the guy who is got the sign on the side of the road, or the ministry who's suffering, and you hear about all the time they're suffering, they're struggling to get by, the pastor's having to take a job, and you are like, yeah, but I actually gave to United Way certain amount, and so there we go, I'm not giving this other amount. When the truth is that's why you earned it in the first place. Did I say earned it? No, I shouldn't say that. That's why you were given it in the first place. Now, is that always the case? No, absolutely not. And I'll remind you that there is definitely a certain amount of grain that you are supposed to keep back from your crop harvest for your consumption before you sow again, right? But feeling entitled to that is a very different story. Coming up with an imagination why you should have and the other shouldn't is wickedness. Coming up with an imagination why you should not give a tithe to a ministry or help the man on the side of the road because he might go get a bottle of alcohol. What business is it of yours? That's somehow exploitation of your hard-earned dollar. I would love to show you what else you have exploited with your money. You see, a righteous person is not somebody who's thinks that they're good. A righteous person is not somebody who follows the rules, because I'll show you what rules you don't follow. In fact, Paul said, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And James, even though this is blown way out of proportion in mainstream Christianity, says if you break one commandment, you've broken them all. Now, that's not true. What that was a metaphor for you can't what? You cannot do it perfectly, but you also can't believe that you're anything special because of the ones you do keep. Because I'll show you all the ones you don't. I'll show you all the rules you broke compared to the one you keep, compared to the one that you do follow. And here's the intrigue. I don't know if you've noticed this, but have you ever seen someone actually step into a state in which they did a bunch of stuff wrong, and now they do one thing right, and that one thing right cancels out that bunch of stuff wrong? Oh, no. It is a very different operation, isn't it, with humans? You do a bunch of stuff right, but you do that one thing wrong and it cancels all the things you did right. That's in marriages, that's in relationships, that's in friends, that's in associates, that's in coworkers, that's in subordinates, in children versus parents. Oh my goodness, you could dump Toys R Us on your kid and do one thing wrong, and they're going to remember that one thing over Toys R Us. Promise you. Now, there may be a reason for that, and it probably could be a good reason, but we're not going to get into that tonight. But the whole idea here is that I can cancel your merit with your demerits. So you are actually entitled to nothing. Now, what does that mean? This is going to sound crazy, but it means you don't actually have any rights except that which is protected. Now, the intrigue here is that that's going to start with Torah. Torah is a rights compendium, as it were, right? Torah is going to be a communication of social justice, a force of benefit, right? Torah is a force flowing from the intensification of all power in the universe down into you as instruction to benefit your life. Yep, I said that. And I know there's a lot of people out there who would say that Torah is not that thing, but all Torah is a model of everything else. The speed limit sign is a Torah. It's an instruction to not supersede that amount, with all kinds of research behind it, all kinds of reasons why. Nowhere in the law, right, like Colorado revised statutes or New York revised statutes, do we find a place where it says you can go a little bit more if this is happening. If there's traffic, you can go fast. It doesn't say that. So when we do that with instruction, we do it with all of our heart. The heart that is supposedly obedient to God. The heart that is supposedly willing to protect the preservation of life, the innocent, etc. If you create entitlements, your heart becomes accustomed to entitlements. It becomes memory and becomes habit and becomes assumption. And if it has confirmation bias, then it becomes condition. And if we have that going on, then it's really, really hard to fix. You would have to desensitize, you'd have to hypnotize, you'd have to do all kinds of things to get that person out of those entitlements. So how do we break free from this? Well, that's not necessarily what this is about. This is more information about how you use your imagination inappropriately, right? So the simplicity is you use your imagination to make it okay to do horrible things, and you think that these little tiny things that you do aren't building up to something else. Because you think that you can actually compartmentalize your heart when you can't. Your heart operates as a holistic process of the body. Every time you sear your conscience, you cut off just a little bit more of that love. Yes, it's dynamic. It's not black and white. It's not like you say, oh, I can go 5 over the speed limit, and next thing you know, you're a human trafficker. That's not how it works. You should have learned that from this last video last Shabbat, where we talked about how it didn't start with the people leaving Egypt thinking they were going to build a golden calf. They moved into a state of entitlement by which they believed that they could break the rules. That's important. That's important the next time you want the Baconator. That's important the next time that you feel that you need to get ahead of traffic because you're late. You know what's intriguing about all this is, if I had to come up with an absolute truth, like an axiom or a law about entitlement, it's this: entitlement is a way to absolve yourself of the responsibility of protecting the realistic limitations that you've been given, that is a force of benefit in your life. Now, if it's not a force of benefit in your life, we're going to deal with that. So you could see how this revelation about tenses and this revelation about process now comes into play. Because why? Because what do? We believe that we have received. And oh, the sickness that should bring to you. That your entitlement is activating Yeshua's words for a malevolent purpose, altering the actual fabric of reality with your imagination about why you do not have to, or you're allowed to do something that you've been told not to do, or that you've been told to do. 365 negative commandments, thou shalt not, and 248 thou shalt. And you're going to come up with a reason why they don't apply to you. And you're going to use your imagination to do it. You're going to visualize the outcome. You say, I'm not a visual person. Listen, the subconscious does not speak words. The subconscious does not hear words. The subconscious, that autonomic system that responds without your permission, that's built off of those neuropeptides that are categorizing, deleting, distorting, and generalizing information and turning it into perceptions about what we see, what we hear, what we understand. That part is built into a process that you can't control. And the subconscious does not speak English, Chinese, Spanish. It doesn't speak languages. It speaks symbols. Which means all that information that's categorized by those neuropeptides is now become memory. Imagination becomes memory. And when it becomes memory, it becomes autonomic. And you just created entitlement, which is what? Manipulating reality for a malevolent purpose. Well, let's look back at the definition of witchcraft. Are altering natural order processes to affect human behavior for a malevolent purpose. Literally creating supernatural change in reality to cause humans to do something different than what they would normally do for a malevolent purpose. What's malevolence? It is the antithesis of benevolence. Somewhat yes and somewhat no. I think they kind of fall into their own category. I think the opposite of benevolence is neglect. Not consuming somebody else's resources. I think we do more to stick our head in the sand of the social injustices of the world than we do to actually create those social injustices. I think a small percentage, 10% of the population, creates social injustices. 10% of the population is actualized, and they have begun to alter that. 80% of the population is so oblivious because they're in a constant state of creating entitlements. So it's not like you're just going to go 0 to 60 and just become this evil person. But the antithesis of malevolence is definitely protection of the innocent and of those who could be exploited. We'll call them weak, but that's not a good word, is it? It doesn't necessarily demonstrate the idea that there are certain beautiful minds, certain beautiful people that can be neglected, abused, exploited, that we would call weak. So let's say that it is that we are to protect everything, right? But you can't do that if you're in a constant state of justifying why you don't have to. And that justification is coming from new brain materials, coming from new memories. Oh man, I hope that you guys are getting the level of sickness here. And don't get me wrong, let's just talk for a minute and say that Rabbi Kenatafnu is not immune to this. I have to constantly revise my paradigms because I realize that they contain an entitlement. You got nothing common. Remember, you have no rights except that which is protected, and like kind attracts like kind. If you cease to protect and treat with equality those who are in need of it, then why should you have it? I want you to think about that a minute, because somebody got in their brain that because they threw off the tyranny of England, that they are entitled to their assets in such a way that if the universe asked for them for something or someone, that they don't have to give it. Because we have the private amassing of wealth. Am I presenting a socialist viewpoint here? Yes. No. Because what you don't understand is righteousness is not based upon merit, and righteousness is not based upon the good things you do. Righteousness is based upon a title you were given when he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, and that was slain from the foundations of the earth, and therefore applies to every single human being throughout the timeline from beginning to end. That sacrifice, that merit. So when it says Noah was blameless, when it says that when Abimelech of a Gerar argues with God, when God comes to him and says, "You're a dead man because you took Sarah into your house," and he's like, "Will you slay a righteous nation?" Abimelech was identifying his nation as righteous under the definition by which God, who confronted him, would have defined righteousness, which was through his son. Now, why do I bring that up? Because true righteousness, according to ancient pictographic drawings on pottery shards, is equal distribution of wealth. Taking the extra money that you don't need, not to tithe, not an offering, taking the extra money that you don't need and distributing it. Now, remember I said you don't need. Don't get me wrong. He said keep some bags for yourself, right? Keep some grain for yourself to eat. In fact, you're commanded to eat your tithe in Jerusalem, well, not Jerusalem, in the place where he puts his name, right? Which David eventually established as Jerusalem. But he commands you to go to that place 3 times a year. Don't go empty-handed. And you are to eat and consume your tithe there. And here's the intrigue. You're supposed to take it as money. You're supposed to take it as something tradable so that you can get what? Alcohol, meat, right? Okay. I'm just putting it out there that the Torah itself is saying here, go have a steak and wine in the place where I put my name from the tithe that you actually took back from your income. Now, of course, that gets into the 3 tithe principle, which has to do with savings, has to do with distribution to the Levites, and has to do with distribution to the poor. Whole nother subject. But the premise here is that you are allowed to consume. I'm not telling you to go out there and start putting marks on your back and wear some crocheted burlap thing. I hope you go out there and get a silk suit, but you better distribute the rest of that wealth and not feel entitled to any of it. If tomorrow all things are gone, remember Job. Shall we receive only good from the Lord and not evil? That is a crazy, crazy scripture, right? Now, I know some English-speaking American Christians have translated that word into calamity. I'm going to tell you right now, if you think that the word raw has something to do with calamity, you got another thing coming. But the premise is the idea of accepting lack and decrease as a result of divine universal justice and understanding reciprocation, not as some sort of merit that you earn, but a return on investment. You totally will understand the way a Hebrew thinks about business. And I won't get into the idea of how wealthy some of those Hebrews were. Now, when we're dealing with entitlement, I want you to remember that those are those moments when you feel like it's okay to do something that you were not supposed to do, or that you feel like you don't have to do something you were supposed to do. And when I say supposed to, I mean instructed, commanded, whatever. Some sort of greater has somehow given you the option of benefit to do this thing. Now, somebody's probably going to bring up civil disobedience. And I know that that is something we definitely need to address, civil disobedience. And I know I talked about this in my teaching about entitlement, but again, we're talking about imagination. If you can use your imagination to construct an option to be civilly disobedient as a result of an adherence to your faith in honor, like for example, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were civilly disobedient to Nebuchadnezzar when they were told to bow down to the golden statue when the music played. And they were civilly disobedient all the way to death, and death did not touch them. But they didn't know that. They said, "O king, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. For God is able to deliver us from your hand, but if not, we still will not bow down." They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. But just like those pictographs are a lifestyle of a faithful people, so therefore also did they go and say, "We're not going to do this." How many people today would say, if that ever happened to me, I am just going to bow down. What's the big deal? How many would agree with me if I made the statement that entitlement negates integrity? How many would agree with me that if entitlement negates integrity, then most likely you are going to step into a realm of shadiness whenever you encounter a limitation that you feel justified to violate? As I have walked through this life, I have had plenty of entitlements, plenty of reasons why I could speed. And listen, if you really think this sermon was about speed limit signs, let me tell you, you're missing the point here. Because I'm talking about something much, much greater. I'm talking about the fabric of your reality being altered by your choice to not accept a realistic limitation that is a force of benefit in your life. And in that choice, remember, even the universe is going to respond and say, "Oh, okay, yep, he doesn't actually want to be obedient to that. So he's going to provide you, it's going to provide you with opportunity to break that instruction, to go to overcome, or to create an option by which you step beyond that instruction." That's the opportunity that's going to come. And that's why sin kind of has that thing of at the door and knocks, so to speak. I know that this is an extreme message. Like it's saying, okay, yeah, you know what? In our present tense, we are actually altering the fabric of reality and therefore creating a very different world than the one that we should be living in. And it's your fault. Yes. I want to remind you that if you are the change that this world needs, you need to overcome two postulates. The first is what? Or maybe it's a presupposition. I don't know. I hate using these stupid words. The idea here is that we're working from a perspective of the actionable process of reducing forces of benefit in our life. And the universe is responding in kind. But also, there is an element here that you have to overcome when that it's the day when somebody actually changes this thing, when they actually do what they're supposed to do, that will be the day. When this country turns itself around, or maybe this country will get turned around by such and such, not realizing that the country that needs to turn around is you. You are the one that needs to change. You are the one who's creating the problems. You are the one who is using your imagination to alter the fabric of reality, and therefore, what? Creating reciprocations of that, creating attractions of that because of the energy that you're moving with, right? Remember that idea of frequencies joining together and getting and moving into unison with each other, et cetera, et cetera. And what's the second one? So what one says everybody else is the problem, and the other one says someone else needs to make the change, right? Yeah, no, you're the problem. You need to make the change. So what change actually needs to occur here? Well, in its simplicity, you need to stop thinking that you have somehow earned something, that you somehow have a right to something as a result of merit. When the Bill of Rights was created, it was not designed around the idea that you would somehow earn those rights. They're inalienable. Didn't pronounce that very well, but you get my point. If they are inalienable, then that means that it doesn't matter what you do, you still get that protection. That is not an entitlement, that is a protection. That doesn't give you permission to violate those because you think that they don't apply to you, or that there are certain circumstances by which they can be mitigated. So there's a big difference between actual legitimate rights and entitlements. You're not entitled to not listen to someone else in the sense of making them stop talking. You're entitled to plug your ears or walk away. They can say whatever they want. And the reason they can say whatever they want is because of where they live. They can say whatever they want. Should they? Not necessarily. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? If, it's like there is a speed limit variation that occurs between the middle of Grand Junction and the turnoff to go to Moab. And it goes from 70 to 75 to 80 to 85. All because of a change in the state line, but also some people's votes, right? Maybe some research, I don't know. But the premise is what's the difference between those two signs? It's the same terrain, same type of change in road. In fact, the road heave here in Grand Junction is worse than it is in the place where they have the 70 miles an hour. Anyways, I'm not in Grand Junction, in Palisade. But the premise is that it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter that is that way and that is that way. You're not entitled to go faster. If you go faster, you face the opportunity to be told, I told you not to go faster, right? And that's the premise here. So when it comes to change, what you need to do is accept that you don't have a right to things because you've earned them. You have a right to things because they're universally available to you, like private amassing of wealth, which means you have a right to what? You have a right to have assets that are your own. But don't think for a second you earn them by your moral merit. It's a simple thing to overcome in your brain. You just say, there's no one good, not one. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. And he was slain from the foundations of the earth, which makes him what? Retroactive before Christ and after Christ applying to us, right? And so the principle is that if it's retroactive, then there is never an action or a non-action that has put you in a position to gain or lose a right or material. And if there is a loss of that, then I would look at reciprocation or I would look at expansion, but that's a whole nother story. Overcoming entitlement is so easy. All you got to do is just realize you don't deserve it. It's not that hard to realize that if you start to look at the things you've done wrong, because I'm willing to bet you that you actually already do. I'm willing to bet you that when you're sitting alone in quiet, thinking about the things you've done wrong that no one else knows about, that in your mind, you're thinking you don't deserve these things. And so we get to the other side of this, that entitlement creates self-loathing, right? So now we have vain imaginations creating a false identity, and thereby, since you are Elohim, a false God, and thereby what? As soon as you start to make a micro adjustments to it, bowing down to them. And you guys thought it was only about idols. No, that's the Peshat level. So can we move into an area where it's not actually your stuff per se, but instead is a stewardship of God's stuff, not your children, but a stewardship of God's children, right? I know that sounds kind of off the wall, and it kind of flies in the face of private property, which is a huge part of the American evolution, right? Going from being these colonists who were exploited by King George to being these revolutionary sovereigns creating their own government and having their own sovereignty. Am I speaking against patriotism? Am I speaking against the premise of honoring the Bill of Rights? No, not at all. In fact, in context, I will tell you, whatever it was that you were given in your Bill of Rights, in the Constitution itself, that sentiment of government and that idea of being for the people and that idea of being some sort of free people is gone. Some of it is gone as a result of justifiable actions. For example, the Patriot Act, which everybody pushed through believing that it was somehow going to be a force of benefit, when in fact, all it did was encroach upon that original set of rights. So I can tell you in a weird sort of way, even though that it has nothing to do with entitlement, you don't have those protections anymore. But it's not a result of your merit. You didn't lose them because you did something wrong, and you didn't gain them because you did something right. And that's the point I want to get at tonight. If you can disassociate yourself from merit and stop believing that you somehow did something right or wrong, and that results in some sort of desert, then you can overcome entitlement and you can come back to reality, because there's something here in reality that's beautiful, amazing, and waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, waiting for the glory of the sons of God to be revealed, Romans chapter 8. And so when we are working with this model of imagination, I'm showing you what's not first, right? And then when we start to get into the actual imagination itself and explaining how we can alter these things, It's going to be powerful. But let's disengage ourselves from believing that we merited anything. And let's disengage ourselves from believing that we have a right to devalue somebody enough to exploit them, to devalue somebody enough to not protect them, not protect their rights, not entitlements. I have no interest in protecting your entitlements. I could care less whether you like something that I am or do or think or speak. But I do believe that if I ever encounter you in a state in which you're being exploited, your race, your choices, your religious affiliation, none of those things are going to stop me from protecting you, because it's not about merit. And that arrives at a very important element of entitlement. It disavows you of being a protector. So I think that's enough for tonight on entitlement, on imagination. It's amazing how we use our imagination to either delete or distort a limitation that is a force of benefit in our lives, because we just won't accept that it's a force of benefit in our lives. We can't deal with the idea of being limited, when the truth is you just need to let that go. Stop worrying about the limitation, because the truth is in the end, you're probably afraid to be exploited. And that again is going to activate some sort of mess, right? The universe is going to respond to your micro adjustments. Okay. So I think that's enough for tonight. Next time, we are going to talk about limiting beliefs. So for now, I will say shalom, shalom. For those of you on YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and disengage the channel. And for those of you who are not on YouTube, we'll talk here in a minute.